people are expecting. People are expecting quite a bit.
This is your time.
You want to win. You're going to be like this.
There are no shortcuts in life.
You'll get better because you make each other better.
The inches we need are everywhere around us.
I know plenty of people that are capable. I know fewer people that are willing.
You have to believe it to do it.
Now, what are you going to do?
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Sideline Sessions here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for joining us. We're pleased today to have Adam Sarancik back on the show for part 2 of our conversation. If you haven't heard our first episode, I encourage you to go back and check it out after this one. You don't have to listen to them in sequence, but they both cover a variety of great topics. So a lot of good stuff to share, and that's why we're having another one here. Adam is the owner of Elevate Sports Academy, and he mentors student athletes in physical conditioning, nutrition, career and college counseling, and sports skills. And he has spent most of his adult life mentoring youth ages 8 to 22 in baseball, softball, soccer, and basketball. His baseball teams have consistently won championships at youth and high school levels, and in administration, he has served as a league founder, board member, coaches and players clinic director. Adam has also written articles for a variety of publications, including ABCA's Base Inside Pitch and CoachesInsider.com. He has a few Amazon best-selling books on coaching baseball, including Coaching Champions for Life. And today, we are going to be talking a lot about that word championship, and specifically how to run a championship practice, including the questions a coach should ask in order to determine whether a practice was at that level, and reflecting on it, really thinking intentionally about how are we conducting our practices and are we preparing our teams for success. Adam, really pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Ross. I really appreciate being back. I enjoy it very much. I want to thank you, but more importantly, the coaches and administrators and everyone involved in youth sports and all the things that they do. They can never be thanked enough, including officials. I think sometimes they get left out of the thank you process. So if those people are listening to your great podcast, they're going the extra mile, and we just want to always be sure to thank them for the countless hours they spend making the experience as good as it can be for the youth that are participating. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So to get into today's conversation, let's start by defining what is a championship practice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Championship practice is one that connects with the players to make them better people, trains athletes to further their athleticism, and as well as, making players better players. Okay. I have a philosophy, person, athlete, player. And I think that, and I'm glad that you started with that, because I think we have to start with a comparison of, say, a traditional approach to running a practice, coaching a team, versus the way I'm advocating that it be done. Traditionally, coaches focus on developing players, coaching players to win games and championships. And if they win games and championships, they have a lot of fun. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just, if that's your goal, that's fine. I think we can do more at the same time we're doing that. Also, the life lessons that we hear talked about involved with sports in those traditional ways are learned by inference. Okay, they're learned by experiencing. So in baseball, for example, they say it's a game of adversity. And so by just experiencing failure, not hitting as well and as often as you would like, or making an error, you learn how to overcome those kind of adversities, that it's a game of failure. But in my philosophy, those things are not learned just by inference and experience. They're actually proactively designed into a practice, okay? So in my approach, I have a saying that we coach people, not sports. We coach life lessons within the game for beyond the game, using sport as the vehicle to do that. It's the quality of the person, not the player, that's the most significant outcome. So specifically, the way I recommend going about practice is remembering that you really can't train the athlete until you connect with the player. And you cannot develop the person. You can't train the athlete before you connect with the person. And you cannot develop the player until you've trained the athlete and connected with the person, because The players that have the most potential are the ones who trust and believe in their coaches. Okay. And the best athletes have the most potential to be the best players. Okay. So I have a saying, better people equals better athletes equals better players equals better teammates equals champions for life. So every practice design and every phase of practice should be approached with, how am I connecting with the person? We'll talk about that a lot. How am I training the athlete? Okay. And then how am I developing the player?
When we talk about that process of creating that championship practice that you've described and defined, and one of the things you've also referenced in your response there is the importance of the people, connecting with the people, training them, the players, the athletes. It also applies, of course, to the coaches. So these are all the different individuals, many, depending on the sport, quite a number of individuals who are involved in practice, who participate in what that practice is, who within that has a role to play in the creation of the championship practice, and what relatively are those roles?
So you have a coaching staff that hopefully preseason and pre-practice, you get on the same page about what your goals are for the season, for the week, for the practice. Okay. You have to all be on the same page about what's our mission, what we're really trying to do here. Are we just trying to win games and championships? Is the emphasis on making better people, better athletes, better players? What's going to be our approach? Okay. And how are we going to go about that? So you have to be on the same page. Secondly, of course, you've got to make sure that you're teaching the same fundamentals and mechanics so the players are getting consistent messaging. And that's not only true for that team, but one of the mistakes leagues make is the players get inconsistent messaging year to year. The leagues don't do a very good job of making sure year to year that the players are getting consistent messaging and they're getting progressed appropriately for their age and development with their skills and positions in life. But also the players, we have a saying in coaching that the standards are the same year to year. The players rise to the level of the coaching standards, but the coaches have to adapt to the personalities of the players. Every team has different individuals on it from different home life situations, different school situations, and you have to get to know those players and connect with those players to be able to know how to get them to trust and believe in you, how to make them feel safe, and how you're going to coach them. All right. So you've got auditory, visual, and kinesthetic modalities, and you got to get to know your players, which one's going to work best. Kids today are not basically auditory learners. So spending a lot of time telling your players, your athletes and players what to do is not going to be the most effective way of teaching them. You've got to come up with visual and kinesthetic cues to do so. And then, of course, the parents can assist in hitting ground balls, hitting fly balls, doing a lot of stuff to free up the coaches to actually coach. You shouldn't have your parents necessarily coach, but they can certainly do a lot of things to volunteer and free you up to actually get out and demonstrate and actually stand alongside your players and give them a visual reference and to see you have some fun too.
Right.
So, and then of course you've got to get your parents to buy in on the mission of the team and the purpose of the team too. It's a huge purpose to have this meeting to make sure everybody's on the same page of who we are and why we're here. Okay. So yeah, takes a village.
And I'd like to dive further into that point of players on the idea, right? Or really having them truly, authentically understand the importance of why we need to practice in a certain way and how that connects to what's going to happen in the game. And I do feel like it relates a lot to the other conversations I have on other shows around other aspects of education, right? Things that happen in schools and in the classroom, and how do we get better at really having students designing learning that is relevant to what they want to be doing, but then really having them understand the relevance and applicability of things. Okay, this is how this will relate to these things that you're going to do in the future. The same thing here with practice, right? And I feel like there's at least a high level of variability about how well that's done. I'm sure there are plenty of coaches who don't necessarily design practices at that level anyhow, right? But for those who are thinking about this, wanting to do it, doing it, understanding it's not going to be a high quality practice unless the players on the team understand what that needs to be, understand why, and we can do it consistently, right? If we want to have championship practices, we need to do that every time, not once in a while. But that really starts with, I think, the coach's responsibility to break down, here's why we're doing this drill. Here's why we have to have this mentality. Here's what this prepares us for, and for the parents as well. But athletes at various levels, but really any youth or amateur level, there's going to be plenty of them who consider practice to be the less important thing that you do, right? Versus, I think once you're talking about your really high level athletes and professionals, right? They might have an understanding that practice is the most important, right? And that's what sets you up for success. But how, right? How is that? How do you have those conversations? How do we help athletes to see that, young athletes, and to really make those direct connections between this thing that might seem it doesn't, always relate exactly to what you even think the game is, and why are we doing this, and why do we have to have effort or focus on this, and oh, okay, here's why.
Yeah. So what you're bringing up is, again, first addressed by the mission of the coaches for that team. If we're just about winning games and championships, what tends to get discussed is we need to bunt this way or play bunt defense this way to score runs, prevent runs from being scored, and to win the game. Okay. What happens there is that the players' view of how they performed in that game and during that season is solely related to wins and losses. Okay. Well, guess what? There can only be one winner. There can be one champion. If that's the sole focus, you got a lot of disappointed kids and parents out there. Okay. But if you're training and rewarding the process, and if that process is as much about making them a better person and a better athlete, and you're constantly praising and rewarding them improving at the process, then the result is something to be an aspiration, but it's not the end all. Okay. So you feel good about who you are and what you've accomplished because you've understood, okay, our team didn't win, but you know what? I certainly improved a lot. I'm a better player, but I'm also a better person and teammate. Okay. And that's why those things have to be proactively designed into the practice so that you are not just teaching by inference, but you're actually using things like quotes. And that's why I wrote the book, the Takeaway Quotes book. You're using acronyms, you're using role plays, you're using guest speakers to discuss at a minimum at the beginning and the end of every practice, say a quotation about work ethic and adversity at the beginning, a quotation about life, becoming a better person, and something about integrity and treating others well at the end of practice. So they go out with a mission, or being just a better son or daughter. Okay. You're actually programming discussions about that into the practice. And then if you set that up originally, say in your team meeting to begin with, then you can constantly refer to it. And if you and the coaches have done your planning properly, when it comes time to, say, reacting to a bad call that caused you to strike out with the bases loaded, okay, you can use that example of, and this is what I use in my book, how would you react to a pop quiz in school that you didn't know about, you weren't expecting, just like you weren't expecting the umpire to call a ball 6 inches outside a strike. All right. How are you going to react to that? And how are you going to overcome it? So you're constantly using what they're learning in the game to help them be a better student, help them be a better son or brother or sister, and eventually how to help them to become a better community leader. But you have to work at this from the perspective of, this isn't going to be just about whether we win or lose. That's not going to define who we are. There's that old saying, winning games and championships doesn't define who you are, and it doesn't define who your team is. How you react to them defines who you are and who your team is. Okay. Let me give you a quick example, Russ, of a player I observed last year. It's an 11-year-old pitcher that I watched pitch at the beginning of the year. Had a rough outing. Okay. Just long story short, rough outing, but was able to throw some strikes and was able to keep his composure most of the time. But he got some upset when some errors were made behind him. Okay. Et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the year, I watched him pitch again. He now had 2 different pitches. He was able to hold runners on, even pick a couple runners off. His team was he gave up runs, but they were a result of errors, but he was able to keep his composure. Okay. And in that game, he was the last pitcher that pitched for the game, and it was the last game of the season. Okay. He came off the mound visibly upset. I mean, really, really upset. And there was no amount of encouragement or rehab that the coaches could do to get him out of the funk, and eventually just started crying. And his last words to the coaches, and in effect for the season, since that was the last game, is, "I suck and this team sucks." It was because they had lost more games than they won, and they would typically lose by a lot. And the whole focus was on whether we won or lost. It was completely, out of his mind, the fact that he was a much better pitcher in 5 different ways. He was a much stronger person in 5 different ways, because those things had not been emphasized during the season. His whole self-esteem, self-image was tied up in whether they won or lost. And that happens, Ross, a lot, where it's all about the winning, and players are losing perspective of the more holistic view that we should be taking about why they're there and what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think about, I have something that's coming to mind that's it's not specifically about practice, but I think it certainly is about what might be observable as far as athletes' mentalities and their attention that they're giving to opportunities to improve. But I'm wondering how you think about intervention or reinforcement with those who don't really seem to be getting it or who aren't naturally bought in. I'm thinking of something, this is 12 years or so ago, but in my previous life, I started my career working within Major League Baseball. And so I was working with the Arizona Fall League, with the kind of top prospects from across the sport. And we had a couple of days where Rod Carew came to talk to the players and do a variety of things. But one of the things was to visit the clubhouses, talk to the players. And of course, he was working with the commissioner's office at the time. He might still be, but well-known Hall of Fame player. And so one time in particular, he's in this clubhouse and he's there before one of the games to just have a conversation with a lot of the players. And there was 2 guys who stood out to me in particular, one of whom was over to the side, not paying any attention to this at all, right? And I just noticed, this is kind of interesting. You're trying to make a career for yourself in this sport, and you're not interested in what one of the great hitters of history is going to share here. And then there was another guy who was a pitcher who had been a really highly regarded prospect for a premier franchise, right? But had a couple of rough years, and his prospect status had been dinged. I think he had made his major league debut at that point, but it didn't go so well, and then had a couple of even not so good years in the minors. And at this point was, we're not really sure if this guy's going to make it. And he was, invested, right? And he even asked the question of, what did you do when you struggled? Like, how did you overcome your struggle? And he was willing to engage, to be vulnerable, to ask that question, to say, let me see what I can learn from this. And, and now having the benefit of having seen how their careers played out, and this is obviously not the only factor, but I have found just time and again that having the right attitude, being the right type of teammate, being the right type of participant within the teams can certainly, it makes a difference on whether or not you achieve your potential, right? Or
Sure.
don't. And everybody has maybe different levels of potential, right? Some players are so talented that they're going to succeed no matter what. But then that guy, and this was not the only example of him having really strong character, ended up having a really good career, made multiple all-star teams, and ended up, being much more similar to what he was originally expected to be, because he figured out how to overcome those rough times. And the other one, unfortunately, he never made it right to the major leagues. And whether or not he would have anyway, I don't know. But a really high percentage of the players in that league do make it. So, I mean, all that to say, like, that could apply to anything with a team, right? That could apply to anything with practice. You mentioned having guest speakers. You mentioned these times where it's like, do you get it or do you not? Are you trying to take advantage of every resource available to you when you have somebody in front of you who has been where you want to be and done the things you want to do, or has some knowledge or insight that can help you? Are you saying, I'm going to be at the front of the room trying to learn from that and get whatever I can out of it? Or are you going to be over there not paying attention or thinking, I don't need this, this doesn't apply to me? When we're doing whatever we're doing at practice or in a drill, right? Are you saying, okay, let me figure out how to do this right? Let me think about what happened in the last game that didn't go the way I wanted, and how can I work on that today and make sure that next time it goes better? Or am I not even putting the thought into making those connections, or just kind of going through the motion? And then when I'm the coach and I observe, okay, this athlete is just not quite getting it, or I might need to go over and have a conversation and explain what the opportunity is here, right? Not even what you're doing wrong, but here's why this is something you should see as a really valuable thing here. And I guess, how do you think about handling those types of situations, whether it's, we've already had this conversation, right? and I'm not getting a lot of buy-in here, or, you know what, I'm noticing something that maybe I assumed everybody would understand this, and I can tell that this individual it's not quite connecting. So maybe I need to make sure to be a little more explicit in having that discussion.
Yeah, so I think where you're going with that, what you have here is a classic disconnect between the coach thinks the purpose of the team and drill or practice is, and what the player thinks is the purpose, and that the disconnect with what the coach thinks the player should be getting out of the team, the drill, the practice, and what the players are actually getting out of it. And what it's pointing out to is they never established commonality to begin with, why we're here and what we're doing. And secondly, it's the old adage, whether it's a teacher in any setting, whether it's a coach teacher, a teacher in the classroom, or a parent teacher, sometimes we talk too much. We don't really know the people that we are trying to educate because we're not listening to them. We know what we want to try to teach, but they might be listening because they're on, either we're not communicating, but well, we haven't earned their trust to where they feel safe with the fact that we understand them and are going to be actually able to teach them in the way they can learn, so they feel insecure. All right. Number two, we haven't really listened to where they're at, what's going on in their head. Okay. So let me just give you some very concrete examples of where this goes awry. Okay. So the preseason meeting with the team and the parents, you got to get on the page about why we're here, what we're doing, and how we're going to do it. All right. Before practice, you need to have a meeting about what the practice plan is, and again, what the purposes are of it, both in developing them, mentoring them as people, training them as athletes, and developing them as players. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, you have to get a summation of those things. But all along the way, the biggest mistake that is made by every educator and a coach beginning, middle, and end, is they talk too much. They're not asking the players, what is your perspective? What do you think? All right. So let's just use an example of the way most coaches coach a drill, whether it's a throwing, fielding, or hitting drill. They do the drill, they hit a ground ball, they hit a fly ball, the player hits the ball off a tee or thrown to them or whatever, and they say, oh, nice job. What you could do better, how you can improve is this. They're telling the player what they think the player should hear. And yet, two things would be much more effective. First of all, start with, what did you think you did right? Give me one thing or the most important thing you did right. So you're building a self-esteem and you're actually getting the player to think about themselves in a positive way. And then you tell me what you think you could have done better. What did you feel? What did you try to accomplish? And how do you think you could have done it better? All right. And then after the drill is done, you ask the player, how do you think that went? You would be surprised that the negativity that they're describing about themselves personally and the way they performed or the way generally they are as a person, well, that doesn't surprise me. I always suck. Okay. Or the way the team is doing is consistent with how they're going to exhibit that in the game. It shouldn't be a surprise that this player has a bad attitude in the game, because if you had connected with him in practice about what he thought went well, what he thought went not so well, both at a certain phase of practice and at the end, you would see you've got a huge disconnect in whether that player's bought in or not. But if all you're going to do is talk to them and tell everyone what you think they need to hear, you don't really know what's going on in their head at all. Because you have to remember, this generation, Ross, is not a verbal generation, all right? They're a device generation. They're scrolling left and right, and they're putting out information, okay? They're not as good as they need to be at listening, at empathy, all of these life skills. So if you're going to spend your time talking at them, you're not going to connect with them. You're just not. And you're going to see examples of, as you just said, players not buying in, players acting out inappropriately, because you haven't really connected with them by listening to them about what's going on.
So let's get into that topic that I previewed earlier, of the questions a coach can ask to determine whether I ran a championship practice. Let's start with, I know you have many of these and they're all, important, but do you have a few that maybe stand out as the top three, or if not the top three, the first three, like the starting point, the most frequent and consistent ones I need to be asking myself?
All right, so I have 22 of them, and I don't think it takes long to run through them. What I was going to do was kind of set out as a context for these 22 questions, how I run a practice and how I develop a phase of a practice, okay? Mm-hmm. But we've talked about other good topics, so I really won't go into that a lot. But you can, let me just, before I get into some of these, let me just set a framework of the normal practice is not really person, athlete, player oriented. It's, let's have a team meet, let's do some kind of basic dynamic movement, warm up, let's play some catch, and then let's do some throwing, fielding, and hitting drills. And we end with, we might do one thing about team defense or something, and then we're going to end with some kind of game at the end or something like that. It's really not very thorough, okay? And maybe it's the subject of another podcast or whatever to go through how practice should be set up. But let me at least get into the basics of phase design so you can kind of understand why I'm asking the questions that I ask. So at every phase, I don't care whether it's what I call an athleticism phase or a phase to teach throwing, fielding, and hitting, you have to always have this person, athlete, player orientation in your mind. You have to always keep in mind, how am I going to connect with this person? Have I learned about this person to where I know his or her personality and how I'm going to motivate them? I mean, primarily you motivate by catching the person doing something right. But I mean, as we know, Ross, there's different things that connect better with different people. Okay, so you got to know them. So can I connect with this person? Secondly, do I understand how they learn? Have I developed the programming of this phase to incorporate visual cues as well as kinesthetic cues to make sure that I'm going to be able to connect with players who learn by those modalities. Okay. Athletically, you have to be able to, as a coach, visually and sometimes literally, be able to see the athlete, look at the player and see the athlete. All right. So I may want to have this player, say in fielding a ground ball, get their thighs parallel to the ground, their back flat, and their glove hand wrist flat. Well, can they actually athletically do that? I mean, physically, are they able to, do they have the ability to get their legs parallel to the ground? So sometimes the bottom line is the solutions to problems in the sport are not solved by sports skill drills. They're solved by deficiencies in athleticism. It may be physiology, strength, power. We ask them to load their back hip when they throw and field. Maybe nobody's ever taught them how to apply and transfer force. Again, that's got to be taught. Okay. We are asking them to steal a base in a certain way or run for a fly ball in a certain. Well, maybe they haven't learned their body. They don't have proprioceptive skills to understand the positions and their movement of their body in space because they've spent their whole life holding a device, whether it's a phone or an iPad or whatever. All right. So these things have to be trained. Okay. And you have to be able to look at the person and say, we are not fielding the ground ball well. We're not throwing it well. It's first need to be solved with some athleticism training. All right. We need to improve their proprioceptive skills so that they can move optimally in all planes of motion in a coordinated manner. Okay. And then a player's point of view, like I say, you've got to be sure that you're using the 6-step teaching process. Okay. It starts out with dry mechanics without an implement. Then you add the implement, the ball, the bat, the glove. And then you go and you add those things in, and it starts with stationary, it goes to easy movement, then game-like movement, and then you actually add in competitions and things like that. There are 6 steps, and most coaches start with step 5. They start with hitting a ground ball, hitting a fly ball, hitting a ball off a tee. That's step 5 in the process, not step 1, okay? So, and then within every phase, you have to do 4 things. You got to assess is the team at and where are the players at, okay? Because you can't know how to teach them if you don't know where they're at. When again, you have to assess them as people, you have to assess them as athletes, you have to assess them as players. And that relates to your goals, all right? You got to know who you're working with, and you have to have goals for the season, goals for the week, goals for the practice, and you work backward from there, okay? So you have to assess where they're at. Then you have to teach them, okay? And again, you got to use all the different modalities, and you have to teach them as people, athletes, and players. The problem with the teaching part is coaches focus primarily on action, and they forget about preparation, anticipation, and reaction. Preparation, who, what, when, where, why, and how does something happen? And again, it's not just our opponent, the other players, the officials. Don't forget to include in your preparation how certain officials officiate a game. That's a very important part of it. But the preparation for them as the mental aspect of the game, okay, visual and physical things like visual acuity, and then life skills like personal self-care, nutrition, rest, sleep, hydration, mobility, all the things part of recovery, and then life lessons and baseball lessons. All that's part of preparation. Then anticipation, how do you recognize those things when you're in the game or in the classroom or at home? And then reaction. Coaches frequently, they spend their time coaching action, but they don't coach reaction. And yet, as we know, the best fundamentals and mechanics in the world aren't any good if you can't get to the ball on time in a coordinated manner, okay? So you got to do those things. You got to assess, you got to teach, then you've got to go to how am I going to progress or regress them, okay? So you've got to know how to progress them, meaning that you've got to know how to make it more difficult or more complicated, all right? And a key part of reaction and progression is randomization. Coaches get into too much predictability, okay? So you've got to vary, speeds, locations, directions, give them randomization so it's not predictable, right? And then finally, so you got to assess, you got to teach, you got progress or regress, meaning make it easier if we have to take a step back. And then there's competitions. At every phase of practice, you have to have competitions. Okay. And it doesn't matter if it's in the athleticism piece, throwing and receiving, hitting, you constantly have to compete because you have to, in order to win games and championships as well as do well in life, you have to learn to control what you can control, and you have to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. All right. So yes, assess, teach, progress, and compete. Those things have to go into every phase of practice. Within each phase, you have to always keep in mind the person, athlete, and player. Now, to get to the question that you asked, what are the questions and how do they relate to those things? So the very first question is, in my practice, did I make the members of our team better people? Okay. How do we do that? We use quotes, we use acronyms, we do role plays, we have guest speakers. Did we make them better people so that they're going to have life lessons to take away both in that day and in the future to make them better sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, students, employees, and community leaders? All right. Secondly, did I use what I learned about them and taught them in being a better person? Did I use it when I trained them to be a better athlete? Okay. So that they understand, hey, you know what I taught you about nutrition? You know what I taught you about self-esteem and whatever? Yes, we're on athleticism. That's going to help you not only now, but for the rest of your life. And then the third question then is, did we use what I taught them about becoming a better person and what we taught them about when we trained them as a better athlete? Did I use both of them in the way I went about developing them as players? Because again, as we talked about, everyone's a little bit different. And so I have to look at every player and say, this player's deficiencies, they may all have in common that they could all hit the curveball better. But why they're not hitting the curveball better may relate to a physiology thing. It may relate to a psychology, mental thing. It may relate to, how I taught them. I just didn't teach them right. All right. I'm trying to teach them all to hit the curveball in the same exact way. And so I have to remember that, yes, the result is to get them to hit the curveball better or to be able to turn a double play better. But the way we teach that and actually get the most out of our people is an individual thing. All right. There's some individual things that need to go along with it. All right. So those are the first three of the 22. We can stop there. I'm sorry, I've been talking for a while, but that kind of lays the foundation for the others.
Excellent. If a coach finds that, I guess they're consistently that the answer is no, so to speak, or that they're not getting the answers they want when they're really reflecting on these questions. Obviously there's a variety of different questions, so it's not, but it's a little generalized. But are there a couple of things you recommend to say, okay, here are some of the actions I should take to, maybe it's more generally, how do I get better as a coach at creating the types of practices I want, or really thinking about what's within my power to improve, to be finding that these are going better, that these are improving?
It depends what kind of problems you're having. If you're having a lot of discipline problems, I would suggest master teaching what you know before expanding what you know. John Wooden said, I have very few problems with discipline on my teams because my players are constantly learning, and I'm constantly emphasizing the results will be taken care of by the process, and I'm constantly rewarding the process. So if you're having a lot of discipline problems, you're not listening to the people that you're coaching. You really haven't learned about who you're coaching and how they think and how they learn. Okay. And you're really not very good at teaching what you know. You may be into the drill of the day thing where you're going online and going on YouTube to get in your mind, a better hitting drill or better fielding drill. And you're really not connecting with the people and learning those things. So if you're having discipline problems, that's handled one way. If your team's just not playing very well, then you've got a coaching methodology problem. You don't understand the step teaching process. You may not be teaching fundamentals and mechanics that are actually sound. You are doing what you were taught as a player growing up, or what your coaches did, and those may no longer be valid ways of going about it. You haven't kept current on the actual science relating to pitching or hitting or whatever. You're just going what you think was right. There's a whole lot of coaches that know how to play the game well, but playing the game well and being able to teach it, especially to teach it to this generation and to kids with different personalities and different ways of learning, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And then you have coaches that actually may know quite a lot about a particular part of the game, pitching, catching, infield play, or whatever, but we're asking them to teach all aspects of the game. All right. And all they're relying on is parent help to do that. When a better way of going about it, in my opinion, if we're truly interested in development of players, is the players shouldn't be asked to be coached by one coach covering all aspects. The league, first of all, should be providing resources for training coaches how to teach, training what the proper mechanics and fundamentals of mechanics are, so the players are getting consistent messaging year to year and are being progressed properly. But they should also be on the same page and help these coaches out and learn what are the strengths that our team of coaches have. Maybe we should be sending these players to clinics 2 or 3 times every week to the coaches, let's just use baseball as the example, that actually understand pitching, that actually understand catching, that actually understand and know how to teach infield play, outfield play, or whatever. And that way they're actually being taught by coaches that really know what they're talking about. And we're league-wide getting consistent messaging on this. And then once a week, we can have a practice with our so-called team where we can work on base running and team strategy and tactics, right? So that to me would be a much better way of developing players who are interested in actually getting better. All right. So I guess what I'm saying, Ross, it really depends on what kind of problems you're having. You know, is it problems in just basic being able to perform the skills of your sport? Then I think you have to look at what information you're teaching and how you're teaching it. But if you're having problems with team chemistry and discipline and those kind of things, then you got to look at whether everybody's on the same page about why we're here and how you're rewarding performance. If you're rewarding performance strictly by batting averages, ERAs, wins and losses, you're going to have a lot of disappointed players, especially in sports like baseball. Okay. But if you're rewarding the process along the way, and if you're rewarding life skills like their ability to not just completely implode when they make a mistake, you've given them a mistake ritual and they're able to carry it out, then you're constantly building up their self-esteem, and you're going to be much surprised at how much better your attitude of your team and your players on your team are going to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And Adam, it's been great having you back on the show. And I have a question that, as I'm thinking about it, it's getting more and more complicated in my mind. But to wrap things up here, but if it gets too wild, we can always have another conversation.
Sure.
But it goes certainly to following through on a lot of what you've talked about and how we take this into the game, right? Take what we're doing in practice into the game, but specifically along the lines of, I think a lot of what you've talked about has related to not having players only define success as just with wins and losses, and being able to see the progress within that, the areas in which they are becoming better players, the ways in which the things they do in practice are helping them get a little bit better here and there. But let's say in the situation where you feel as though your team is practicing the way you want to, but at least at a team level, that isn't translating into results in the game. We're not winning any more games than we were when we started, and our practices have gotten better, and I can see how individuals are improving, but it's not translating into wins for whatever reason. How best to balance that process of helping the players see how they are succeeding in various ways without undermining, I guess, the message about the importance of the team, right? And the team matters. In other words, right, trying to instill in players that understanding of You're making progress every day if you're doing things the right way, and you might be having success in various ways. And so the wins and losses aren't the only thing that matters, but also, we still want to believe in the importance of team success, not strictly individuals, if that makes sense. So that's a very kind of, I think, complicated topic, but,
Well,
just, I
let
think
me
it
just
follows
give you
along the
some
lines of this
examples.
conversation. Yeah.
If you are constantly, every practice, every drill, every phase of practice, emphasizing process and emphasizing life skills over sports skills, you're just going to have a lot of happy players, and they're just going to just feel good about themselves, especially if you're constantly getting feedback from them. But also, what you're talking about is how do you measure progress? Okay. And there are a lot of ways of doing that objectively over and above wins and losses. You can win or lose a game by something kind of quirky at the end of a game. Okay. And it can happen a lot. All right. And your overall record may not be great. But if along the way in your practices, you're able to demonstrate, through technology, there's a lot of technology things that'll show a player how fast they're swinging the bat, how far they're hitting the ball, how hard they're throwing the ball. If you're actually tracking the number of strikes they're throwing, their ability to throw different pitches for strikes in different situations, if you're actually tracking all these things and giving them feedback consistently, they are actually seeing, well, gosh, I started the year and I had these measurables, and at the end of the year I had these measurables. Okay, so just from a purely, and you can do that with your athleticism training about how fast they run, how high they jump, how quickly they move, whether it's agility, their ability to do all kinds of measurable athletic things. So you can see where they were at the beginning and see where they were at the end. But you can also do it on a personal level too. All right. You can have players write notes at the end of the season. Give me 3 players on this team that you learned something from, or you really thought contributed to the team in a personal way by their attitude, by their ability to stay calm, blah, blah, blah. And you can, they're going to be anonymous who they're from, but then you can actually give them to the people or read them to the people, out loud. And some of those notes and letters they carry with for the rest of their lives. Okay. So first of all, I think that we've got to be careful that we don't define good coaches and good teams by wins and losses, and players don't define themselves by their batting averages or ERAs. I have a saying that a $300 aluminum bat can disguise a lot of mechanical flaws. Okay. You may win a lot of games because you have a couple of dominant pitchers, and you may be winning those games against very mediocre competition. Okay. So, I tell my teams batting averages and ERAs are like grades. All right. They're only meaningful if the standards were really high, if the competition was really tough, and if you had to work really hard to achieve them. Okay. Your team wins if it does 2 things. If you could have defeated your toughest competition today, okay, regardless of whether you won by 2, all right, could you have defeated your toughest competition today? And did you inspire others by the way you went about your business to be better people in their own lives? By your work ethic, by your ability to overcome adversity, by your esprit de corps, how you treated one another, your sportsmanship, all those kind of things. Did you inspire others to be better in those lives, in their own lives? If you did those 2 things, you won. If you didn't, you lost. Let me just end on this, and as far as important questions to evaluate a practice. Number 1, did I get better today? Okay, all right? We spend all this time thinking about our players, but the question is, did I, as a teacher, role model, and mentor, did I get better today? And then secondly, did everyone act excited to come back tomorrow? If everyone's excited to come back tomorrow and to play next year, you probably did a lot of things right. Okay. So I think those are some questions always, maybe consistent with the whole fun aspect too, is did I see my players smile and laugh today? And maybe more importantly, did they see me and my coaches do the same? I have a saying that a day in coaching without seeing your players smile and laugh, and without them seeing you do the same, is a day wasted in coaching. All right.
Yeah, that's a great way to end it. A great question. I think that applies at any level, but
Sure.
certainly when we're talking about high school sports, youth sports, right? But no matter what, at any level and whatever the players' goals are around the sport and whatever level they're competing at, if they continue to be motivated and excited about coming back the next day and continuing to work on it and continuing to be part of
Yeah.
that team, then right, it means that you are doing what you set out to be doing, right?
Yeah.
Whatever your goals
Exactly.
are as the coach, whatever the goals are for your team or for your program, or if you're working with individual athletes, if they feel like, okay, can't wait for tomorrow, that's a great question. And if the answer is yes, that it's a good indicator. Adam, thanks again for being part of the series here. And listeners will put the information below where you can find some of Adam's articles and books. Again, if you haven't heard our previous conversation, you could find that in the feed as well and learn a lot more from him there. And we hope you enjoyed these conversations. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know things that stood out, anything you'd be interested in learning more about as well. And we'll continue to cover all of these topics here on the show that are relevant to those of you who are coaching or if you're parents of student athletes. We'll just continue hitting on the topics that will benefit you. So please do subscribe to Sideline Sessions if you haven't already, and visit bpodcast.network to learn about all of our other shows as well. Adam, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I'd love to come back and do it again. But thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.